Well, I found out like 3 to 4, 5 years into this that we were actually felt so strongly about doing our high school football. I lost track of doing this 20 or 25-minute show. I was extending this thing to like 45, 50 minutes. And they were actually putting Letterman, they were taping Letterman in the station and then just play him right after I was done. So he wasn't live in our markets there in Mississippi. He was actually on
Wow.
tape delay by like 20. Whenever I decided to get done, they would just roll Letterman right after.
So
It was
you
kind of
you were
funny.
so good that you would push Letterman and people didn't say a word about it.
I didn't hear about it for years.
What is up, everybody? It is Jake with Master of Football back at it again. Happy Monday. Thank you so much for being here. If you want to be updated on all things college football, pro football, Madden, EA college football, NFL draft, anything related to American football, hit the red subscribe button. You will not be disappointed. Also hit the like button too. Again, like, share, comment, subscribe. Quest for 1,000. We're almost there. Without further ado, let's get into the video. All right, guys, in my travels as a YouTuber over here, we're coming up on here just a little over 2 years. I have met some really, really cool people. A lot of people from the professional sports world, some people from the college sports world, and again, from the commentary world, I'll say. There's one that has definitely piqued my interest for the longest time here. I kept on hearing this name, Mark Rogers, Mark Rogers, Mark Rogers, Mark Rogers. I was like, who the hell is this Mark Rogers guy? I come to find out, not only is he former ESPN employee, former Mississippi Sportsman Caster of the Year, he is a very well respected name in the college football YouTube world, has a giant college football channel that we're going to go ahead and talk about here. But yeah, like I said, 40,000 subs, this and that. He gets a hold of me and he's like, hey, dude, I want you to be on my show. Complications, I wasn't able to do it. And he says, you know what, man, I wasn't able to get you on my show. How about I show up on your show? I was like, huh? Baking powder? You want to be on my show? Sure, man. So I had him on. I had an interview just yesterday. We're posting it right now. It's awesome. We talk about everything. We talk about realignment. We talk about sportscasting. We talk about, NIL, transfer portal, every single thing, rule changes, all that kind of stuff in the world of college football. It's a great listen. You're going to have it here. It's about an hour. It's about 57 minutes long. Go ahead and check it out. And again, in the description, you're going to have all of his contact information. I'll make sure that I include that. But here is my interview with our dear friend, Mr. Mark Rogers. All right, everybody, Master Football, family, everyone here. Just want you guys to know, this is a big one out here. Okay, me and my boy Mark have been reaching out to each other back and forth. However, Mark, in his very busy schedule, my man is always live streaming, always posting content, always doing stuff out there. He's the busiest man in college football this time of year. Okay, him and maybe Joel Klatt, David Pollock, those three, they're pushing the envelope out there. But Mark Rogers on my channel, welcome.
Well, I got to tell you, Jake, that I'm sure David Pollock and Joel Klatt are going to be very pleased to know that they're in my category.
Of course, yes, they are. They have climbed the ladder. No, you're good, man. No, don't be short changing yourself, my friend. And especially right now, you notice this too, that college football season has ended, but the college football demand has not. You post videos out there, people are still clamoring for it. As much as and as popular as college basketball is right now, college basketball, to me, I feel like like NBA, it's like Christmas time, and then it falls asleep until the All-Star break. There's baseball is important for at the beginning of the season, and then through the middle, people kind of get just kind of used to it. But football season, every game matters, every week matters, and the off season is the same way. We go from college football season ends, we got recruiting classes to go over, we got spring practice coming up, then we've got a little bit of a lull, probably like July, but things will pick up probably around August. So looking forward to you filling that void for everybody out there, man. I mean, your channel, you're on 40,000 subs. Like I said, I appreciate you being on my little tiny channel right now. But yeah, man, like I said, we'll go. I've got 5 questions here for Mark, and we will go ahead and get started. Let me pull up my questions here. So again, very first one, this will kind of tie into just normal pleasantries here, but tell us about yourself. Tell us about your time at ESPN. What did you do? Why did you leave? Kind of take us through your growth as a sports personality up until this point.
Yeah, so I always wanted to be a sportscaster. I went to Kent State University. I actually kind of carved out my own field of concentration within my major. They never had anyone who said, I want to be a sportscaster, and that's it. So off of my journalism degree, I had a concentration in sportscasting. And I went directly from there to a cable uh, downsize, country radio station slash cable TV radio station, WNCO in Ashland, Ohio. I was a news anchor. Funny story quickly about that was that I wanted to be a sportscaster. I didn't want to be a news anchor. I was just driving around. Of course, this is 1991. I'm dating myself, so no real internet at that point. You had to do everything, through the mail, driving to stations, personal contact. I show up. I don't know that they're looking for a news anchor. I just want a job. I just want to knock on as many doors as possible. They put me in front of a teleprompter. They interview me, and they give me a news anchor job, which was great, even though I hated news. And I told them during the interview, which I didn't know was an interview at the time. They were just talking to me, but little did I know that they had a job opening for a news anchor. And they asked me, "What do you think about news?" Because I was just selling myself as a sportscaster. And I said, "I despise news, hate it." They still hired me. And I asked them after they hired me months later, I said, "Why would you ever hire a guy who just told you they despise news?" And they said, "Well, you read the teleprompter better than anyone else. We auditioned." So there you go. But I was there for 3 years, and fortunately, in addition to the news anchoring, I did play-by-play high school football, basketball, Ashland University. It's a Division III football, and then I moved on from there to WCBI in Mississippi. It's a CBS station. I was the sports director there for 7 years. So Mississippi State, Ole Miss, Alabama were our focuses because they were all within an hour away. And great time covering. I got to find out how important college baseball is in that part of the country because I had not experienced that. I was a huge baseball fan, but I was a Cleveland Indians fan, Major League Baseball fan. I got to experience that. It was phenomenal. Between those three schools, there was always somebody that was hot enough to get to at least a bowl game, get to an NCAA tournament, went to a Final Four with Mississippi State. That was quite a ride. College World Series, bowl games. So just a great time covering SEC football in particular, but basketball and all the other sports for 7 years there at WCBI. So that was phenomenal. Just a great experience. Probably the best job it is the best job I've had, not from the standpoint of earning money, but in terms of the job itself, I pretty much got the run of running a sports department, got to do what rarely did my news director or station manager come to me and say, "Mark, we really need you to cover X, Y, or Z." So I just got to do whatever I wanted every day. And, would do National Signing Day from the Ole Miss or Mississippi State coach's office and with the whiteboard in the background and just sit there with Jackie Sherrill or Tommy Tuberville and do the National Signing Day with them. So it was just a tremendous experience. And then I moved on from there to ESPN. I was at ESPN for 19 years. As a most of that time, the last 15 or 16 as a production operations manager. So think, editors, camera operators, everything to do with a production staff that puts together both studio shows and remote, not to get too involved in the description, but audio people. A lot of the remote games were brought in house in recent years. And I left ESPN in the fall of 2020 to focus on this.
Wow, that is quite the journey, my friend. All the way from the Kent State Golden Flash all the way up until now, my friend. Look at that.
The Golden
Well, that's
Flash.
awesome. So, and speaking of that, and and again, Mr. Mark Rogers here. For those of you who don't know, the three-time sportscaster of the year. It says AP. Is it MS or what? Can you kind of describe what that is and what that entails
Yeah.
to be the sportscaster of the year?
Yeah, Jake. So only so many characters there, of course, in the Twitter profile. So that's
Ah,
three-time sportscaster of the year in Mississippi. That's
oh, okay.
an Associated Press. They would vote on the sportscaster of the year and determine that. So 3 times in the span of 4 years, sometime in the late 90s, was the Associated Press sportscaster of the year in Mississippi.
Wow. And if you think about that, so you described it where it was like you got to show up, basically do whatever you want, and you were the best at it. I mean, think you literally, like you said, it was the best, one of the best jobs you ever had. And based on not only outcome, but the way you thought about it, it just sounds like it was a dream down there. SEC country, talk about sports all day long. Can we talk more about that?
Yeah, a lot of great people that I worked with. I grew up in Ohio. I spent most of my time, my entire life at that point, in Ohio. So it was a bit of a culture shock, but not in a bad way. A lot of phenomenal people that I worked with. Worked at it was a rather small station, depending on your standpoint. There's about a 250 TV markets in the United States, and they're at 125, so about halfway up the scale. But fortunately, we had resources, just tons of resources, just a lot of money. So I could roll a satellite truck whenever I wanted to, an Ole Miss football practice and do my sportscast live from the Ole Miss football practice if I wanted. So we really did it up big in terms of high school football coverage. I'd grab every available person, do 12 or 13 game highlights. It was so funny because we had Letterman. We were a CBS station, so Letterman was on after our Friday night football show, and we would do a very short news segment, and then I had like a 20-minute, 25-minute high school football highlight show on Friday night. Well, little did I know, because I didn't script it. There's just too much going on to script it. You just
Mhm.
fly by the seat of your pants and you just ad lib everything and just roll with the highlights, and just have people that brought in the highlights just give you index cards with the highlight with the shot sheet on it. Uh, what was funny was I was like 3 or 4 years into this, and the other news station dominated our news station except for the sports. And so we were pretty happy about that people were flipping to us during the sports, and especially during Friday night football. Well, I found out like 3 to 4, 5 years into this that we were actually felt so strongly about doing our high school football. I lost track of doing this 20 or 25-minute show. I was extending this thing to like 45, 50 minutes. And they were actually putting Letterman, they were taping Letterman in the station and then just play him right after I was done. So he wasn't live in our markets there in Mississippi. He was actually on
Wow.
tape delay by like 20. Whenever I decided to get done, they would just roll Letterman right after.
So
It was
you
kind of
you were
funny.
so good that you would push Letterman and people didn't say a word about it.
I didn't hear about it for years. I didn't realize this. I like somebody mentioned it to me. It's funny. Letterman just comes up at this random time whenever you're done. I'm like, oh, I never really considered that. And I asked, and they said, oh yeah, for about 3 years we've been just rolling on Letterman, and whenever you're done, whenever you feel like wrapping up, we just roll it. We learned that. Yeah,
Dude,
we'll just.
talk about a flex, man. I mean, literally, like David Letterman waits for me. Okay, okay. David Letterman goes on when I'm done. All right, that's so awesome. And like you said, you get out there. So like you said, so half an hour show, 8 minutes. You do kind of like a certain amount of news there, and then you go into the show. There was it just like what were you talking about? Narratives? Were you talking about the sports? What did you kind of do? How did you go from 20 minutes to 40 and 50? What kind of happened?
Oh, so this was just on Friday night. This was
Okay.
for our high school Friday night football. So for 12 to 14 weeks in the fall, we just knew high school football was big. I recruited every available person to throw a camera in their hand and say, you're going to the backwoods of Mississippi, and I need first half highlights of this game, just because I just thought, I wasn't experienced at the time. So my thought was, I will just overwhelm people with volume, and we will be, if regardless of how well I call highlights, regardless of how good of a broadcaster or poor of a broadcaster I am, they will know this is the place to get the most highlights of high school football on Friday night. And the same thing throughout the week. I didn't realize. See, I was coming to the South from Ohio, and
Mhm.
it was my first sportscasting job. I didn't know how to run a sports department except for let's let's do it as well as we possibly can. So, for example, I noticed that the other stations that we would compete with would simply tape. So, let's say, there's an LSU Alabama basketball game, and nobody's going there. It's too far away, but you're taking the highlights off of ESPN, but they look like garbage. They look like, by the time you would record them and edit them, the quality of the highlights.
Yeah.
So I would just take the extra step, and I started to build relationships with ESPN. Even before I worked there, I would call ESPN, and I would get the actual satellite coordinates to ESPN's sending of the game, and I'd record it, the clean feed, so the colors were better, the graphics were not on the screen, and people would notice that. Uh, just trying to do the very best we could,
Dude,
basically.
you're an entrepreneur, man. This is awesome, and that's crazy. You actually work and develop those relationships. Speaking of ESPN and kind of moving towards that, so you moved to ESPN, you're there for 19 years. Kind of describe why you were there for so long, and then also I'd love to hear the story about how you transitioned from that to what you're doing right now.
Well, I will credit my wife at the time who didn't get me the job at ESPN, but she made me aware of the job at
Mhm.
ESPN. She was just scouring. I was unaware. She just knew that, hey, it's time to move on. And there were a lot of opportunities when I was in Mississippi. I got offered a job in Chattanooga. I got offered a job in Portland, Maine. I got offered a job in Evansville, Indiana, and Mobile, Alabama, and a few other places. So there were opportunities to move on and continue to be like a local sportscaster. So anyway, my wife at the time saw an ad scouring ESPN that they were looking for a particular role where they were looking for producer skills and exhaustive sports knowledge. So we sent a resume and they interviewed me, and that was a pretty exhausting interview process. There was like 3 over the phone interviews. Then they flew me to Bristol, Connecticut from Mississippi, and they just put you through like a car wash of interviews. Like you just meet with like 18 different people, and you're there from like 8 in the morning till 5 in the afternoon. And just, you got to put your best foot forward for like 9 consecutive hours, besides, going to lunch with those people. And that's almost like the extension of the interview. So
Mhm.
it was good enough to, despite 9/11 happening right
Oh,
during that time, which delayed me being hired, everything worked out well. I got hired. And yeah, I have no complaints about ESPN. I was treated extremely well. Great company from the standpoint of how employees are treated. Um, and the people I worked with, you know, that product that you see is only because just the people are phenomenal at what they do.
mhm.
Sure, not every single person, but 98% of the people were phenomenal at what they do. And within a couple of years, I was promoted to a management position, and that's where I stayed for the final like 15 or 16 years I was there, and just very blessed to have tremendous leeway to lead projects. There was a lot of personnel management involved. I had like 12 people that would typically report to me. We had a total department of like 600, but 12 people would report to me. I think I mentioned to you when we were on the phone, an extremely talented guy who was in charge of the audio for College Game Day, like the last 5 or 6 years I was there, reported to me when at the point that I left. So just great relationships, and the ending wasn't the prettiest because of some corporate um, shenanigans of sorts that I think for some people that really know what's going on in corporate America, um, wouldn't be surprised at how things went down in terms of my departure from ESPN and Disney.
Sure, and yeah, we can. That'll be a separate show that we'll talk about on a social thing. But we understand. So separated from there, start up a YouTube channel. Take me through that because again, talking from one content creator to another. Now again, one content creator who was a flamed out junior college football player to somebody who worked for ESPN for 19 years. We got different ramp ups there. Take me through kind of starting that up and building to where you're up now.
Well, Jake, I'm going to tell you that I'm going to just about guarantee you, when you made mention of your YouTube channel being tiny, I would I would be willing to bet that your channel is stronger and has more subscribers than mine did at the same point. Like, it was a slow,
Mhm.
slow grind. I started this YouTube channel in 2010. Now, I didn't really get serious about producing content on a regular basis till like 2013. And then I probably didn't even take much of a business approach to it for another few years after that, maybe 2017, 2018. But this growth has really happened since about 2016 or 17.
Hmm.
That first 5 or 6 years I was talking to nobody, and feel like I am at times now. I have not reached the ultimate by any stretch. My channel has a lot of growth to go. But yeah, the YouTube situation's interesting just because it was one of the basic reasons why I left ESPN is because of their inability to understand the growth of digital media and where we were headed in the industry with streaming, and that being what it was going to be all about very soon.
Hmm. Yeah, and speaking of stream, that's actually a good hedge or a segue into another question here. Let me go on to the other ones that we had. So good knowledge of ESPN and everything like that. Let's talk about that. Again, streaming. We've also mentioned, NIL, the playoff expansion, conference realignment. Talk to me here. So again, about college football, kind of what it's been like since you started to cover it, how it's changed up until this point. Take us through then to now college football. What's your opinion of how it's kind of changed?
Well, I think college football has obviously, it was a big money sport when I started covering it. It was the early 90s. There were, it was a massive industry then. It's only, of course, grown. Now, I would think that most people that are watching us right now may have been in favor of NIL as a concept, as a theory, as something that we were projecting um, a few years ago. But now that it's in place, there's a lot of concern, and I'm right there with everybody else. I have my concerns. I am all for it from the standpoint of you're an American, you should be able to earn a buck based on your name, image, and likeness. Absolutely. Unfortunately, because college football is not governed by anyone, basically the 5 conference commissioners govern their own conferences and do what they want. And I think the COVID season was basically that was the wake up call and the great indicator of how college football works. Every conference did whatever it wanted. Now, some of those conferences are leaders, some of them are more followers, some of them are very much on the same page, i.e., the SEC with its constituents, its fan base, administration, football people, everybody's on the same page. They were all like, okay, we're going to deal with this situation. We're going to take it seriously. We're going to put protocols in place. We're going to do everything we possibly can to make it safe for the athlete. But we are taking the mindset that we are playing football, and then we will deal with this and take all the precautions possible. And it seemed as though the Big 12 and the ACC kind of rode the coattails of the SEC, where the Pac 12 was on the other end of the spectrum. We're not playing football. Of course, we're not going to play football. This is
Hmm.
a worldwide pandemic, and we can't play football. It's look at what's the country's going through. Where the Big Ten, I think this was very telling. The Big Ten was somewhere in the
Yeah.
Big Ten had very strong factions on both sides, but
Hmm.
the academia and the administrators were Pac 12 type oriented. We're not playing football. We canceled the season. But the groundswell of the fans, they're just as serious as the SEC, the coaches, the players. That there was more of a dichotomy in the Big Ten than in any other conference in terms of the choices made. And then obviously the players and the coaches, the fans won ultimately, and then the
Hmm.
Pac-12 kind of rode along with the Big Ten finally.
Yeah,
Uh,
Pac-12, they kind of like, I guess we will, I guess we'll play. But like you said, the Big Ten, everybody other than the presidents in the Big Ten, I think, like you said, there's certain strong factions. You admit it was a really good idea there where you had said that before when you talk about the SEC, because it seems like alumni base, fan base, administration, athletic director, everybody's in the same path going forward. Whereas and you see this in conference realignment too, where it seems like there's different factions pulling different strings here. I mean, we're seeing the whole situation with what does Stanford and Cal mean to the Pac-12, versus what does Oregon and Washington mean to the Pac-12? Are we talking about football importance? Are we talking about conference affiliation importance? There's lots of things like that. Kind of talk about. We'll kind of lean into realignment because realignment's the 800-pound gorilla in the room right now. talk about that. What's going to happening recently? I know that for you, you've been around this for a while. I feel like from what I can tell, it picked up around 2010 with Nebraska to the Big Ten, and it's only sped up since then.
Yeah, and with these latest two moves, USC, UCLA, and the year before Oklahoma and Texas, now it's pretty obvious to see based on the football on the field, more so the financial aspect of it, that we're looking at two super giant mega conferences in the SEC and the Big Ten. Even if there's no more major expansion or realignment, they're the ones making all the money.
Mm-hmm.
So, what I think is I think the two main driving forces going forward of expansion between those two is going to be just their assessment of the field. So the Big Ten, for example, looking at Washington and Oregon and assessing, and it seems as though they're in this process right now of assessing what is their value to us. Are they going to
Mm-hmm.
make us a stronger league? And that doesn't necessarily just mean once we add them, renegotiate media rights. Are we going to make more money per school? I think that's part of it, but it's also just, does that corner of the country mean something to us? Do those brands mean something? Are we going to be a better football sports product? Of course, academics mean something to the Big Ten as well. Are they
Mm-hmm.
going to make us better once we check all the boxes? I think that's one driving force is obviously the Big Ten and the SEC assessing the field, the SEC assessing Clemson, Florida State, and we can dive into the grant of rights and what that really means. But let's take that out of the equation. I think it's just a mere assessment of who's left on the table and whether they add value to the conference. And then the other driving force, I think, is just what we saw the last 2 years. The SEC made a major move. They're already number one from a football and with Oklahoma, Texas, a financial standpoint. And the Big Ten basically saying we can't let them drive the sport and get that far ahead of us. So we're going to make a major move now. So if one of them makes another major move, then that may cause, even if that other conference doesn't deem uh, the remaining actors on the table as being valuable enough, it may be a tit for tat, punch counter punch type situation.
Yeah, and with that punch counter punch situation, and you'd kind of alluded to it really quickly there, and I'm in the same spot right here. I am not a lawyer. I work in human resources, but I understand enough to know that the people who are in the know that the ACC has the greatest crappy contract of all time because apparently they're all locked into that thing. There's nothing you can do. They're staying there. However, if a couple of those teams were available, then does because the ACC is kind of in Big Ten territory and it's in SEC territory. Now I know with the additions of USC and UCLA, they broke all the rules. Now it's just basically all its own situation there. But man, the ACC, North Carolina, Virginia, we're talking Georgia Tech and Miami. I know Georgia Tech is an AAU institution, so Florida State is already complaining about their contract. I mean, if that were to, let's just say, be voided, what do you think happens there with all of those ACC entities available at this point?
Well, I think that there's a hierarchy. I think from a football standpoint, it's pretty obvious. We've got a football audience watching us. They know who's good and who's not and what the brands
Mm-hmm.
are. But if you combine that with TV markets, combine that with academics, I don't know that Florida State and Miami don't run to the head of the class past Clemson once you tie some of those other things into play. And then I think it would just be, again, we're kind of dismissing the grant of rights temporarily
Oh yeah.
here, that there's a fight between the Big Ten and the SEC as to grabbing those schools to a certain extent, with the Big Ten being a little bit more particular about the academic end of it. If I'm the Big Ten, now that I've gone to go get USC and UCLA, and I'm looking at the ACC, my top two priorities, not necessarily my only priorities, but my top two are Florida State and Miami.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you look at the Big Ten, you can check uh, resources and finances, and they check every box. They just signed the best media rights deal that was a stroke of genius. Well, I don't want to go. That's a bit of a strong statement, but a visionary type move that Kevin Warren made in making basically an NFL model type
Mhm.
agreement with three different. When you're on CBS, Fox, and NBC during every
Mhm.
college football, and you cover all the time zones, you cover all the TV windows, and each one of them, even if they're not broadcasting in a Big Ten game at that particular time, well, they're going to be telling you that they just had a Big Ten game on and showing you the highlights, or they're going to be telling you coming up next is a Big Ten game. The Big Ten is going to be talked about on those three platforms constantly all day on
Mhm.
Saturday. So it's a great move on that part. But the only thing that the Big Ten has or does not have in competing with the SEC is enough players. There's not enough players in the footprint to keep up with the SEC. So that's what makes Miami and Florida State, among other things, attractive to me if I were the Big Ten.
Yeah, absolutely. Because yeah, you all of a sudden. I know that Florida, specifically the Florida Gators, apparently, and again, this is all we're all talking about. There's connections from what we know. That Florida does not want Miami in the SEC because they want that access to Miami, the only SEC partner in Miami. Blah blah blah. However, if they jump to the Big Ten, the Big Ten's already shown the ability to go across the country to get what they want. Miami to New York, Miami to DC, not too long of a distance. So yeah, they basically Miami and Florida State moved from the little brother of Florida to all of a sudden probably getting 10, 20, 30% more money. And again, that's a guess here, but that's a crazy move out there. I mean, but again, this right here, let's segue into another question here. All these questions all kind of bleed into each other. We already talked about it a little bit there. Realignment seems to dominate the college football landscape. What can you tell me about the media partner side of the coin in those realignment discussions?
Well, there's a value standpoint there that the networks are obviously looking at. So first thing that comes to mind is that I used to give tours at ESPN, and the client might be from, I don't know, Microsoft, and there's like three business guys, and they just want to see ESPN, and I'm taking them around campus. Well, I would sometimes ask this question. I would say, "What do you think is the most valuable property commodity on this campus?" And they would talk about, "Well, you just took us in this room with all this crazy equipment, and there's a million." And no one would guess, well, no, it's TV rights for sports. It's owning the NBA, it's rights, it's owning the Monday Night Football, NFL rights, college football rights. So that is the last bastion of kind of property that the TV, the mega TV networks hold in college football, because their studio shows are dwindling in popularity because of stuff like this. When they used to hold that market, now what do they have? They've got television rights, so that's everything to them. Big time live sports events is their last calling card to um to being at the top of the list of sports commodities. So it's just extremely important that they maintain that and don't let it get away. Um, and they're obviously looking at value. They're assessing the value of um, the league, the teams involved, versus what they're able to charge. I think the Pac-12 has painted itself into a corner. Unfortunately for them, they've allowed everybody else to take up almost the entirety of the TV slots on a Saturday, and they're still sitting there. And obviously, anytime you're in a negotiation, and the negotiating partner knows that you're desperate, that's not a good place to be. So the longer this goes on, the more these media companies know that the Pac-12 need them desperately. Um,
Yeah, and you mentioned there too that like the most valuable entity that ESPN holds at this point is a piece of paper somewhere that says media rights this and that. That's a couple of pieces of paper is the most valuable thing they have. So, do you think that's a contributing factor behind because there's two different things here that have been happening. There's conference realignment and there's conference expansion. Now that the realignment is expansion at the same time. Do you think that's the reason why we're trying to see the Big Ten get to 16. They were talking about 2024. SEC would probably follow suit. Do you think that's a big reason why those conferences are getting to that point? Because the media partners, they want more, better quality games, or what do you think is going on there?
Well, what I think's going on is, and this almost ties into what I alluded to with the COVID year, that gave us a great indicator in how college football and college sports generally are run, and I don't think it's a healthy thing. Is that when Oklahoma and Texas want to leave the Big 12 and they knock on the SEC's door, and the SEC says absolutely, because we're grabbing two of the top 10 brands in the sport, and the same thing with what the Big 10 has done. Um, is that good for college football? I don't believe that it is. But that's not Greg Sankey or Kevin Warren's job. Their job is to be commissioner of the SEC and the Big 10. So it's not like an NFL move. The NFL does what's best for the NFL, not what's best for the AFC West or the NFC East. They do what's best for the entirety of the sport. Unfortunately, we need a commissioner in the sport or some type of governing body that's going to do what's best for the sport. In the meantime, you're going to have these mega giants doing whatever they want. That's one of the reasons why, ironically, the Big 12 has protected itself to a certain extent, and good for the Big 12. I think they're safe. I think they're stable. I think they're good to go. But as vulnerable as the Pac-12 is right this second, we were saying the same thing about the Big 12 2 years ago after they lost Oklahoma and Texas. What's going to happen? They're down to 10. They're down to 8.
Mm-hmm.
They're down to 8, and it was kind of teetering as to if the Big 10 would have stepped in and said we want Kansas and Iowa State, then that league could have completely dissolved.
Yep.
But they went and got the 4 best. They did as well as they could. They're not keeping up with the Big 10 and the SEC by doing so, but they did as well as they could to stabilize their league. And it's kind of odd that, at least in my perspective, the Big 12 is stabilized by its mediocrity. The SEC and the Big 10 don't want any of those schools. They're not adding value, while the ACC is less stable by having 3, 4, 5 brands, if you go to North Carolina and Georgia Tech, that are valuable. And so they may be, and you made a statement a few minutes ago about the ACC having the longest crappy contract.
Yeah, the greatest crappy contract of all time.
That's perfectly stated, because yes, it sucks from a financial standpoint, but it's out to 2036. So if the grant of rights is everything that we're told that it is in terms of being this ironclad contract, the ACC's good till 2036 or close to that, because it tends to break down the closer you get and the more opportunity possibly to leave. But what's the ACC going to do in the next 13 years to improve the value of its league so all those schools don't jump ship automatically in 2036?
We don't know, and I think that, unfortunately, if what it looks like, the ACC is just crossing its fingers that the Big 10 and that Ohio State doesn't want the pie to be divided up 18 ways, 20 ways. That's kind of what they're hoping on at this point, because unfortunately, if the SEC adds, the Big 10 is going to add it. If the Big 10 adds, the SEC is going to add it, and so on. So I think that for us, we'll probably see, probably 2032, 2033 close. We'll probably see, because like you said, the contract will expire in 2036. We'll start to see a couple of these people kind of go out there. But the crazy thing is that's still 10 years away. But we're talking about the Pac-12, and the Pac-12 is in everybody's mentions right now. It is the talk of the town. What's going on? Where are we going here? Where are we going there? I want you to put on your crystal ball here. What do we hear about in the next week, 2 days, 3 months, 6 months? What's going on with the Pac-12? What do you think?
So I've posted a few videos and brought this to light a few times, and I don't think I'm some genius for doing so. This is all pretty obvious. So there are a number of dominoes. Those dominoes include, at the low end of the scale, SMU and San Diego State evaluating the Pac-12's contract to say, okay, we're going to make a lot more money going to the Pac-12, but if they lose 4 schools, they may not have a Pac-12, so we'll stay where we are. The Big 10 needing a commissioner to go forward with whatever plans they have, and then making a decision on Oregon and Washington. And then Oregon and Washington are obviously going to jump to the Big Ten. They've already applied for the Big Ten. That's where they want to be. But if the Big Ten turns them down, do they go to the Big 12 or do they go to the Pac 12? So for me, the first domino to fall is most likely going to be the Pac 12 contract that we're expecting to drop sometime in the next 2 or 3 weeks. That the Pac-12 is going to deliver this contract, and it's going to say our media rights deal is $26 million a year, and then it's going to be up to Colorado, Utah, the Arizona schools to determine, is that enough? And you would think that they know what that number is. There might be some other things involved that need to be figured out, travel and some other things, and maybe some other things that the Pac-12 could possibly do to sweeten the pot. But generally, those schools should all know. I would imagine there's no way that they don't know. Right now, they've figured out what's that dividing line, what's that number. They better hit 32 million or we're gone, kind of deal. So that's the big domino that needs to go. It's funny because you hear about all the conversation about the Four Corner schools going to the Big 12 or being pursued by the Big 12. Oregon, Washington, I think it's kind of an assumption that they're the two best football brands in the conference. And the Big 12 would love to have them. Then you had Stanford and Cal, which to me seem like West Coast Big 10 schools. And people think I'm ridiculous because nobody goes to the games and the football teams are bad. But obviously, Stanford has shown us just 10 years ago that they can be a very good football brand. Cal hasn't shown us that forever, but I don't know if they're a package deal or not, but they're obviously, from an academic standpoint, exceptional. And I don't think their TV market means much based on them playing the games. But once Michigan shows up to Stanford or Ohio State shows up to Stanford, I think about a game Ohio State played at Cal in 2013. That Cal team was 1-11. Ohio State showed up and the place was packed. So you're wanting a prediction.
No, I mean, just kind of give me, I mean, you broke it down really well there. And I agree with your mentality there, where it's like, I think that the Kevin Warren, when he was because he's no longer with the Big Ten, his mindset was, I want Rutgers and I want Maryland. Again, he wasn't there when he did that move, but he wanted USC and UCLA. He wanted Los Angeles. He was thinking, I want Seattle. I want Portland. I want, the Bay Area, not because he expects that when Michigan plays at Stanford, it's going to be a bunch of red fans in the stands. It'll actually probably be a bunch of Michigan blue, but a bunch of Michigan graduates from go out to the Bay Area for jobs. So there's a lot of situations like that can definitely. We also know that most of this is TV money, but all right, we'll go back to that because it looked like you were trying to avoid it, my friend. If you had to give a prediction, what do you think is going to happen? You're a crystal ball. You think you're the final arbiter here. What do you think is going to happen?
Strictly a guess here.
Strictly a guess.
Because I will challenge our viewers right now to think outside the box, as I have tried to do, because that USC UCLA thing came out of nowhere. We don't know. Maybe the Big Ten goes after the two Arizona schools to pair them up with, I don't know. Anyway, I'm going to say that for the time being, meaning for this particular media contract, that the Pac-12 is going to be able to hold it together. But in the next 10 or 12, not even that long, in the next 6 to 8 years, the Big Ten is going to pick it apart. Some combination of the Big Ten and the Big 12 are going to pick it apart. I heard somebody mention the Pac-12, George Kliavkoff, having the schools, after this media rights deal is struck, signing a grant of rights. Like, I don't know what kind of leverage he has to force these schools to, do you want us or not? We're not signing a grant of rights. You need us. So.
No, and I think going off of what you said there, I agree too, because it's one of those things where once those contracts expire, I mean, while back when the Big Ten added Penn State. Penn State was kind of out there on an island by themselves out there compared to the rest of the schools. So they added Rutgers and Maryland, kind of give them a little bit of an Eastern wing out there. I think what will happen is probably something similar, that LA schools are, for the most part, I mean, LA flies direct to most places in the Big Ten. Baseball, the schedules are going to be pretty brutal. It's going to be tough to kind of do that. But if you add a West Coast wing, so to say, you add a Stanford, a Cal, and a Washington or an Oregon or something like that, then they almost have like an Eastern wing. You play a couple games there, and then you'll have, instead of, 4 cross-country trips, you only have 2 or something like that. So I think that will be something that will come up. But I agree too. I think that the Pac-12 will hold it together, despite what the Big 12 fans believe is going to happen out there. I think the Pac-12 is going to hold it together. But if they lose, if the Big 10 comes calling, or the SEC or this or that, there's so many things to kind of go off of there that we can go. And again, this is the reason why realignment is so fun, is because you can literally just talk about it forever and ever and ever and ever. But what we'll do is we'll move on to our next and last question here. So, and it's kind of alluding to that, because again, it talks about realignment. I also want to get your opinion on NIL. You had mentioned something that I want to talk about. This last question here. The SEC dominates on the football field currently, while the Big Ten dominates in the bank account. What trends across football do you see happening in the next 5, 10, 20 years? Conference realignment, rule changes, NIL, anything like that. What would you say you think you're going to see in football in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years?
Well, I'm sure if we could fast forward 20 years, there would be certain things that nobody would guess would have happened, just like 20 years ago to today. I will say that what I don't like is that the NFL has a better product on the field. That's obvious. They're professionals. They're better. But college football has a place in this country because it's a great sport on the field, but it blows away the NFL when it comes to the pageantry of the sport. The rivalries, the colors, this is what kills me about all this realignment and expansion, is it is torn at the fabric of the geography of the sport. The Big Ten is supposed to be the Big Ten. It's the Midwest. The Big 12's kind of in the plains and so forth and so on. And now that's been completely disregarded, because there's something about a Big Ten SEC bowl game, or a Pac-12 Big Ten Rose Bowl, et cetera, because not just are those teams from different parts of the country, but they represent a different value system, a different just vibe, feel from that part of the country, different music, different food, just a different way of life. It's charming. The charm of the sport is being ripped apart by these mega conferences, because that's what college football has always had over the NFL, is the charm factor, the marching bands, the cheerleaders, again, the pride of the school and the conference. And, I think about when you watch NFL games and you see the players announce themselves. They have the starting lineup, and each player says, "I'm so-and-so, left tackle, Michigan." Well, what are they going to be saying in 5 years when they played at 3 different schools? Now, you think of your favorite schools and think of your players in the NFL, and you can take some pride there that they were always, Oklahoma players, Texas players. That's not going to be the case going forward. I just think people are going to people are always going to be attracted to the play on the field because it's exciting and it's good. And people have gotten used to the business of sport. But there's going to be some level of disillusionment, just like I think over the decades with Major League Baseball. It used to be much more endearing to the American public than it is now. Because it didn't become any more of a business, just the money was thrown in everybody's face. And I think this is going to go that direction to a certain extent, where fans are going to become, a certain amount of them, disillusioned with the money grabbing more headlines than the actual games and rivalries.
Yeah. And I think, especially too, when you talk about the regionality of it, I do think that one of the good steps that they had was this 12-team playoff. I actually do really like that. And especially the top 5 conferences, the top 6 highest conference champions get an auto bid. I actually really like it, because then we're going to get to a point to where The NCAA tournament for basketball is awesome. We see Princeton right now; they're doing great. You can always get some sort of upset out there. I do think the upsets are probably a little less common in football, but again, we saw this year. I mean, TCU went to and played Michigan. They beat them, and I know they didn't do very well in the national championship, but the semifinal they did really good too. I think that you were looking at a couple of things there. First of all, I'd love to hear your opinion on NIL and the transfer portal too, because I think that right now, I mean, if you look at the numbers of the transfer portal, it is astounding how many people enter the transfer portal and drop out and don't get it, or they enter the transfer portal because school A offered $50,000 and school B offered 52, and they took the 52 and they're going to move 3,000 miles across the country. So kind of talk about those two things. And again, I know you had some issues with them, but I'd love to hear kind of your perspective on NIL and the transfer portal.
Yeah, so I'm a capitalist and I'm a free speech and freedom of mobility and everything else. So I'm fully red, white, and blue when it comes to all those things. So I am, in theory, in favor of NIL. I just want it to be governed and want to keep some level of the sanctity and the purity of collegiate sports as much as we possibly can. So the first thing that comes to mind is that I don't like NIL as an enticement to a recruit. I don't think it's intended to be. That's against the guidelines. It just doesn't get enforced. I think the Jaden Rashada Florida situation underlines that more than anything. He already knew he was going to make $13 million going to Florida. Well, that's not how that's supposed to work. It's supposed to work that the student athlete still evaluates each school based on the school itself, the relationships they built with the coaches, the football program, whether they can be developed for the NFL, all those other things, and just have knowledge of the NIL collective and that it exists. And, and they can go talk to whomever they want that's currently on the roster and find those things out. But there should not be an NIL package that's offered to a student athlete before they enroll at the school. Sign and enroll. So that's the first thing I would love to see enforced. The next thing would be, and I don't know exactly how to get around this, is I don't want to see collectives get burned by the transfer portal. I would think that most collectives, 99% of them, are pursuing that particular, Texas quarterback because they're playing for Texas. Therefore, their only value to us is because they play for Texas. And once they run off to USC, then their contract should be null and void. It should be tied to, what the collective is desires, and that's to be represented by a Texas quarterback, not just an athlete that's going to go play wherever. So I would like to see that protected. I don't know if that can be currently written. I keep hearing about pay for play and that can't be written into anybody's contract as an NIL. Then I also want to just make sure that these athletes are actually delivering their end and they're not just being thrown money and then they don't do anything for it. And in this world of TikTok and everything, we're not talking about real work here, but they do need to give something back for the NIL. They need to make videos or whatever, post on Instagram or whatever they need to do to compensate or make that exchange for the NIL money.
Yeah, and we have and again, I'm with you too, free speech capitalists. I'm the same way too. However, that does not mean that pro-capitalism doesn't mean pro-anarchy. And right now, it's just kind of anarchy out there. There's people sitting on their own rules. Yeah, we promised to give this to you. You didn't. You had mentioned before. I mean, what if Jaden Rashada shows up, throws 5 interceptions first game, never plays another down? Does the 3, 4, and 5 of his or year 2, 3, and 4 of that $13 million deal, are they still guaranteed? There's just so many rules here that we're going to kind of see. I do think that it will be one of those situations where, when like lidocaine I think it's an anti-pain medication. It's also derived from cocaine. So is NIL going to be cocaine or is it going to be lidocaine? Is transfer portal going to be cocaine or is it going to be lidocaine? Or is it good or bad? We're going to kind of come into the point where we figure that out. But yeah, I mean, especially NIL, I think let me ask you this though. Do you think the reason why NIL is so poorly received was because we're seeing how much money is actually being thrown? Because I know that there's been rumors for years that this was happening at the SEC, big schools, and this and that. Do you think it's just the numbers that get people off, or do you think it's just the sentiment too?
Well, I think that college football fans don't like the transfer portal for what we already mentioned and talked about. They don't want to see their favorite players 10 years from now and know that they went and played for three different schools.
Hmm.
And there's a certain connection there between the NIL and transfer portal. Obviously, an athlete can leave for various reasons, and in the past they've left because they didn't see a path to starting,
Hmm.
or they had an out with a coach, or whatever the reasons were, and then that became very flimsy in terms of uh, what was. See, at one point, obviously, as you will know, the transfer portal, there was a rule that you had to sit out for a year if you transferred. And then there became kind of a hardship uh, disclaimer within that was worked around, and it was legitimate. And if it is legitimate, I have no issue with that if a player's mother is extremely sick and he wants to move closer, that's a hardship. But then that became a joke, and then players would just say that they were mentally distressed or give whatever excuse they wanted to, and they'd be able to transfer without having to sit out for a year. So I would want to get back to a transfer portal situation where there's a one-time transfer and then you have to sit out on the second transfer for a year. Now, in terms of NIL, I think fans are disgruntled because, it's somewhat amusing because based on the feedback that I received from college football fans prior to NIL, they thought that players were getting ripped off for this billion-dollar industry in which they were risking their health and not making anything from that. I would always argue that the college education was an extremely valuable commodity uh, that was discarded. But college football fans seem to think that the player was in a bad place and needed to be compensated. Well, I don't think they need to be compensated for their play. But again, NIL is something that's uh, that's an opportunity for anyone in this country. If the 13-year-old can make TikTok videos and make hundreds of thousands of dollars, then these guys should be able to do the same thing. But yes, the college football fans, I think now that they've gotten what most of them have wished for, don't like to see the way it's gone.
Yeah, and I think you had said a lot of things there in terms of this is how it should be done. It should be happening here. The rules are kind of a joke. This and that. You had mentioned it before too. Final question here: do you think college football will ever get a commissioner?
I think there needs to be a commissioner.
Mhm.
I don't know. What would have to happen is that there would have to be cooperation between the Power Five conferences for them to determine this is what's best for college football. And if they have enough vision forward, they would realize it's what's best for the SEC and the Big Ten, even in the long run, because it's almost like uh, if the New York Yankees become too powerful, well, they need competition.
Mhm.
If they're paying a $300 million payroll and the Kansas City Royals are paying a $40 million payroll, that's great for them in the short run, but in the long run, it makes the sport a joke. And if there's no competition, then there's no allure to the sport. So I would think that those five conference commissioners, or four if it turns out to be, need to get together, and they're going to be the ones that are going to drive that decision. I don't see that coming from anyone else.
Yeah, and it'll be a tough one because you got to get Greg Sankey, whoever the Big Ten as a commissioner. You got to get them to maybe sacrifice a little up front for down the road, and it's tough when we're starting to talk, hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars. But yeah, that's a crazy situation there. But Mark, we are at time here. You have been a very gracious guest. I really appreciate it. Tell the people out there how to find you.
Well, you can find me if you either just put in Mark Rogers TV or the Voice of College Football on YouTube. So just search that. You should be able to find me. and our main channel, The Voice of College Football. But we also have team channels, most likely the team that you root for. We have a channel for you. I won't name them all because there's 25 and about 15 are fully operational. So check those out as well. Again, just put in Voice of College Football on YouTube.
Awesome. Well, Mark, my friend, we will be doing this more. And whenever you need me on your channel, you just let me know. But Mark, thank you so much. You have yourself a good day, my man.
I appreciate the invite, Jake. It was a good time.
All right, guys, that's it. Thank you so much for being here. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, do all that stuff. I really appreciate it. It's it for me, guys. I'll see you guys later. I am out.